Before we saddle up, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from. I want to know which sky you're under as you read. And if you love Western romance with grit and heart, hit subscribe. Tomorrow I've got a tale that will knock you clean off your boots. At 29, Maeve Calder answered to her own ledger. No husband padded her pockets. No father mapped her path. She hadn't come to Blackwater Bend chasing a wedding or a safety net. She'd come for a challenge. When she heard about the widower who owned the ranch and his stallion that had thrown every man in 3 counties, a dark thought of possibility lit inside her. The horse's name was Nightshade, a creature so unrideable the town had begun to speak of him like a ghost, part legend, part danger. Maeve suspected, though she did not know it yet, that Taming Nightshade would not be the only thing that would find its way toward being shaped. Some wild things have 4 hooves, some carry grief in 2 hands and hide a key to a hardened heart. Maeve rode into Blackwater Bend on a Tuesday when the heat already felt like an accusation, and the sun had made the rattle of the road a shameful thing. Her dun mare padded through Main Street as if she owned every inch of it. Maeve was unremarkable by a passing glance, small-boned, wiry, but the line of her shoulders and the steadiness in her eyes said she had spent a life learning not to flinch. The first thing that put her on edge was the hush coming from the big corral behind Thorne's General. In a place where stock was currency and men measured themselves by how they handled a runaway beast, that kind of quiet usually meant trouble. "You hear about the Stallion," called Silas Boone, the town blacksmith, as Maeve dropped from her mare. He was broad-shouldered and had the hands of a man who had often fixed what others broke. "Depends on what you mean by about," Maeve said, letting her boots touch the dust with a soft confidence. Silas laughed, a sound like stones rubbing. "Lady, there's one reason a rider's come riding into Blackwater Bend now, and he's standing in that pen over yonder waiting to send another fool to hell." A ragged crowd had gathered by the corral, curiosity stewed with dread. At the center of attention, turned toward the wash of morning sun, stood Nightshade. He was black as a storm's center, coat slick and almost metallic. He was tall, 17 hands, maybe more, muscles carved under the skin like polished wood. He carried himself with the arrogance of lineage and a defense built from loss. But it was his eyes that robbed Maeve of breath, deep-set, dark, intelligent, and weighted with a sorrow that seemed to thrum. "Beautiful, ain't he?" Silas said. "Mean as a stepped-on viper, too. That one belonged to Gideon Thorne's late wife, God rest her. She had a way with horses, the kind that makes you believe in magic. Since Martha passed, Nightshade hasn't let. Nobody on him, won't let none of us near." Maeve watched a young ranch hand circle the stallion with a length of rope. Nightshade pinned his ears, flexed a rippling shoulder, and the cowboy's efforts were swallowed by force spent in intention. A shout, a boom of noise. Nightshade reared and came down like a thunderclap. The man tumbled in dust and curses. Someone called it the 4th spill this week. Someone else, half laughing, said, "Maybe Gideon ought to shoot the devil beast and be done." Maeve felt something cold in her belly at the suggestion. She'd known creatures broken by life so often that they preferred to fight rather than endure the soft shove of surrender. The idea of unmaking such a magnificent animal made her hands curl. "Where's Thorne?" she asked. Silas pointed to a tall figure standing apart from the crowd. Gideon Thorne was lean and straight-backed, the kind of man the prairie wind scoured and hardened. Worry had settled into the planes of his face, and his dark hair had gone thin and peppered at the temples. Beside him stood a little girl of 10 with sun-stitched freckles and hair braided neat as a hymn. Her small hand was folded into her father's fist. There was no shadow on her face, only the sort of steady curiosity that could still believe in mercies. "That's June," Silas said. "Lost her mama when she was 8. The birth took Martha and the baby both. Broke Gideon clean in half. Nightshade's grief. It's like he's a mirror for him." Maeve's gaze drifted back to the corral, where a man with a contraption of ropes and pulleys had just been unmade by the stallion's fury. "Fools," she murmured. "All of them." "You think you can do better?" a voice said with a smug slide. Maeve turned to find a man with hair arranged like a frontier advertisement and clothes that smelled of railroad money rather than hard work. He wore a smile that never warmed. "Reginald Voss," the man introduced himself, extending a gloved hand that hardly matched his tone. "I've come from Philadelphia to show how a true horseman deals with a difficult mount." Maeve let the offered hand hang. Maeve Calder, and I think that stallion will eat you. Voss's smile tightened. Miss Calder, I have training that predates you. Methods, apparatus, science. A disciplined animal will yield. He pointed to a wagon stacked with iron implements, ropes dressed like snares, and bridles that looked less like gear and more like cages. His assistant, a pale, twitchy man named Harris DeWitt, hovered with hands that trembled every time Nightshade glanced their way. Maeve's jaw hardened. She'd seen men treat horses like engines, programs to be cracked rather than creatures to be heard. Voss's science smelled like theory and fractured souls. Good luck, she said, stepping away. Gideon had moved closer now, June at his side. His eyes watched the scene, heavy with wariness more than curiosity. When Voss entered the corral with his ropes and clamps, Nightshade did not simply resist. He dismantled the whole apparatus with precise, disdainful force. Steel bit earth, ropes snapped, and the pricey fabric of Voss's confidence shredded. The man got himself humiliated back over the fence and out of the pen. When the stallion's gaze found Maeve, something struck her like a physical blow. Intelligence, sharp and lucid. Pain, old and inside. A flicker of something else. Recognition. The moment stretched. A woman who had known the low hum of loneliness and the horse who had been sculpted by absence. Nightshade trotted to a corner and stood like a chess piece placated for the moment. The crowd dispersed, more embarrassed than enlightened, and Gideon approached Maeve with a man's assessment and a father's protection. You thinking about trying? He asked. Maybe. Maeve's answer was simple. Gideon watched her as a man who'd learned to measure what he could trust. He's special. Martha raised him from colt. She understood him. When she died, well, something inside him went quiet. He won't let a stranger become company unless he knows. Maeve felt the old things inside her recognize the things in him, the meeting place of two people who'd been hollowed and filled in different ways. Maybe he isn't broken, she said softly. Maybe he's waiting for someone who will hold his grief without trying to replace it. Gideon's eyes flicked. Most people think grief is an obstacle to be moved past. Most people are fools, he said. He offered her the job. Ranch manager, private quarters in the main house, respect among men who'd forgotten manners. But there was a caveat. If Nightshade didn't accept her, none of the rest would matter. If you're doing this for pay, find another road, Gideon added, stern and frank. That horse reads hearts. My heart's in it, Maeve said, but not for the reasons he presumed. Gideon nodded. Tomorrow, after the dew burns off, mornings are better, he said. It was an unspoken appointment, the start of something neither of them could name. Maeve spent the afternoon learning the lay of the land. The Thorne spread was one of 3 great operations in the county, built on 3 generations' work and Martha's magic with animals. At the boarding house, she'd claimed a room from Agnes Marlowe and learned more about the town than she'd planned. Gideon had been a steady hand before he'd become a hollow man. The ranch had wavered without Martha's patient touch, and June had been a small, bright anchor for a man adrift. That evening, as the sky bled orange, Maeve walked to Nightshade's pen. The stallion lifted his head at her approach. He pricked his ears, not with suspicion, but a cautious curiosity. Hello, handsome, she said, settling at a distance where he could see her without feeling trapped. I know you miss her. I know you guard what's left. Maybe we can help each other. He took a small step forward. It was not a torrent. It was the beginning of a grammar. Maeve spent an hour talking soft and true, telling Nightshade about roads she'd followed and horses she'd trusted and losses that had sharpened her. She wasn't trying to win him so much as witness him. When darkness demanded she return to her room, Nightshade's outline sat solid in the moonlight, waiting like someone who had been taught to watch the horizon for the person who would not come. Dawn crept pink over the plain. Maeve woke before the sun. Wearing clothes meant not to impress, but to survive. She carried an apple in her pocket, small, honest, because she believed truth didn't need to be advertised, only shared. By the corral, a crowd had gathered again. Curiosity stretched thin. Word of Maeve's interest had spread. Gideon stood apart with June shadowing his side. Reginald Voss lingered too, his smooth confidence undented by yesterday's humiliation. He offered to demonstrate before she tried, and the crowd snickered. Maeve ignored him and went inside the pen without trickery or equipment. She placed the apple on the ground, equidistant between her and Nightshade, and stepped away so the stallion's path to escape remained open. No single action was grand. They were all quiet bargains. Nightshade sniffed, then ate. He returned to Maeve with careful steps, a conversation without words. She spoke out loud. "Grief's not shame. It's love with no place to go." The animal's ears flicked. He inched, touched her shoulder with his muzzle. And in that heat of contact, Maeve felt something like permission. She lay her hands upon his neck, not to command, but to be present. Nightshade leaned into her, and the crowd, if they watched, saw less a conquest than an exchange. It was trust grown in small measures. 3 weeks later, Maeve was installed as Gideon Thorne's ranch manager. She reorganized feed runs, negotiated better prices, and restored a rhythm that made the hands respect her more than they'd expected to. Her calm, confident command encouraged the crew to look past prejudice and toward ability. More importantly to her, June took to her like a found sister. The girl followed Maeve about, asking and learning until she became a small mirror that reflected the family life Maeve didn't know she wanted. There were tender domesticities, Maeve teaching June to mend a saddle, to read the wind, to keep accounts. "Do you think Nightshade remembers Mama?" June asked one afternoon. Maeve answered as she always did, with the patience she wished someone had given her when she felt small and lost. "He remembers the love, and grief can make you strong even while it makes you ache." Then a day came when June ran to the house crying that she felt ill and there was blood and panic. She had reached the first month that marks a girl's becoming. Maeve took her into quiet rooms, found clean cloths, and talked of cycles and bodies and power. She wrapped practical lessons in tenderness. When Gideon returned, grateful and vulnerable as a man who sees how much matters to his child, he thanked Maeve with an earnestness that pried open a door in her chest. They shared a single, terrible kiss months into their partnership one night on the porch, a thing that was both gentle and fierce, full of restraint finally undone. June's sleepy voice from the window cracked the world like ice and saved them from a hasty becoming. After the interruption, both stood changed. The acknowledgement between them hummed like a counted promise. Weeks slid into a kind of reserved love. Gideon watched Maeve with a new tenderness in his study. She saw it in the way he tended to June, in the silences that meant he was thinking of forever. The ranch responded, fences mended, stock calm, Nightshade ridden in the mornings by Maeve with a partnership that felt more like equal parts loyalty and newly healed trust. Then trouble arrived packaged in legalese. A letter from Reginald Voss claimed that a spring feeding Thorne's main reservoir belonged to a parcel he'd purchased, and therefore he could cut off their water. The document cited ancient filings written in arch Latin and arcane phrasing. If Voss had his way, Gideon's claim to the water, and therefore the ranch itself, could be endangered. It was a land war, thinly veiled with law. Maeve read the documents. Latin from her convent education rose up like muscle memory. Her mind combed the text. "This references mineral rights," she said. "It excludes water. Whoever wrote this thought to hide behind theology of land, but the water's excluded in plain terms. They would need verification from the territorial archives, 3 days right away. And Gideon's family couldn't risk the time. Maeve offered a different path. If neighboring ranchers were threatened by Voss's interpretation, he'd have stirred an enemy of half the county. Old Olav Peterson, whose family held claim to the adjacent springs, would not see his stock go thirsty. "You'll have to cut through Devil's Pass," Gideon warned. "The creek runs high. It's dangerous." Maeve answered like the woman who had never learned to ask permission when a thing mattered. "I'll take Nightshade. He knows that country." He argued, and then he steeled himself. "Take more provisions," he said finally. "Be careful." They rode into a clouded morning, and Devil's Pass revealed why the name stuck. The narrow gorge funneled water into a violent throat. Thunder rolled like a gavel, and Maeve felt the ground begin to tremble, the river behind them swelling into a floodline. There was no outrunning the fury. Nightshade ran like a thing raised by rivers, sure-footed and desperate. A wall of water tore after them, a living thing with teeth. At the ford, the torrent had become a maw. Nightshade gathered and launched them in a leap that felt like prayer. They landed clutching at wet mud. The flood chewed the canyon clean behind them. Maeve slumped in the saddle, feeling the roar in her bones. Nightshade stood like a king that had risked himself to prove loyalty. In the quiet that followed, she whispered thanks to whatever kept the hoof true. At Olaf Peterson's ranch, they read the documents and found too many parallels. Olav, stubborn and blunt, rose like a bear for his water. Within 2 days, Maeve had amassed enough corroboration to bring to the territorial office. She returned by a safer, longer route, 2 days later, drenched and exhausted, to a porch where Gideon waited like a man set to surrender his worry. The reunion was a small thing and an enormous one. A man who had feared losing 2 anchors found them returned. Gideon's gratitude greeted her with a confession he'd buried under restraint. "I love you," he said one night in the barn, voice flat with truth. Maeve, who had lived long enough to know the shape of longing, felt the same like heat. "I love you too," she answered, and in that answer they welded a new structure out of old pieces, a family taking truer shape. The courtroom confrontation with Voss was a surge of the community. The judge, stern Harlan Crow, listened as Maeve presented her findings. Latin translations, chain of title research, testimony from Olaf Peterson, and a handful of ranchers who would have been ruined by Voss's claim. All of it laid bare the hollowness of his scheme. Crow ruled that Voss's interpretation was wrong, and the claim dismissed with prejudice. Voss left humiliated, his pockets lighter by court costs, and his pie-in-the-sky legality shattered. Blackwater Bend celebrated. Silas played fiddles, Hattie Cross in the saloon poured free drinks, and Olav came across the plain to drink to victory. But among the revelry, Maeve found small pleasures. June's proud smile, Gideon's possessive hand on her back, Nightshade nickering in the stable when she passed. In the quiet after, Gideon asked what Maeve had longed for, asked the question that turns a life into a life shared. "Will you marry me?" He asked it simply, in the barn light among long shadows and the smell of hay. Maeve's answer had been shaped by the months of labor and the nights of small talk with Nightshade, by the child who had adopted her as she had adopted the child. "Yes," she said. "Yes to you, to June, to the stallion who taught us both how to trust." Their wedding came in a spring that opened wildflowers like a choir. Maeve wore the dress her mother had left her, altered and brightened. June wore a braid that had been Martha's. Gideon stood proud and a little teary. Nightshade carried them 3, father, mother, child, from the church to the reception, head high beneath ribbons and blooms. The sight made the assembled crowd weep and cheers both. They rode out after sunset that evening. Maeve leaned into Gideon's shoulder, June tucked between them, Nightshade moving with the same dignified power he had always shown. The ranch house glowed behind them like a promise. Maeve thought of the road that had taught her to be self-reliant, the ways she had evaded the life people expected of her, and how, in the act of honoring someone else's grief, she had been given back her own healing. Taming, she'd learned, was not about conquest. It was about listening when the world howled, meeting the eye of the other, recognizing loss without trying to erase it. Nightshade had not been a beast to be broken. He had been a heart to be met. Gideon's love had been not a claim to possession, but a choosing. June's affection was a gift, and Maeve's own thunder-soft heart had found a place to settle. Tell me where you read this from, which horizon held you while you turned these pages. If this story made you smile, share it. If you want more Western romances with bite and balm, subscribe, and I'll bring another one tomorrow that will steal your breath and mend your soul.